Hi, I'm Laura.
Hey, I'm Stefan, and you're listening to Attributed, a podcast library by Dreamdata.
The purpose of it is to store and share all the knowledge that we have gathered across Dreamdata employees through our LinkedIn Lives, podcasts, and webinars.
The typical topics you'll find here can be stuff like marketing,
Sales,
B2B ads,
operations,
social selling maybe. Hello, everyone. I'm super honored to have this guest here today. Who is you, Andrew, CMO at Paddle. I think there's not a lot of SaaS companies that are not aware about Paddle and how well you guys have been doing the last couple of years. So super interested in digging into your everyday world and particularly this topic, which I think all of us in marketing are constantly having to battle, which is, should we invest in brand stuff? Should we try to increase the short-term demand, which the salespeople are screaming for? And how do we explain this to our CEOs, where to spend the time? But before getting super deep into stuff, it would be super great if you could just briefly introduce yourself and your background to the people listening.
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks for having me, Stefan. My name's Andrew. I serve the marketing function CMO here at Paddle. So my marketing journey started as a co-founder of a content personalization business. So we were in MarTech and we built that business. It was a company called IDEO based in London. We built it up with offices in New York, San Francisco. It was a very outbound target account focused ABM type go-to-market, whale hunting. Our clients were people like Salesforce, IBM and Intel. And we had a really interesting journey that we can dig into a little bit there, mostly focused on demand. We can talk about how that split worked on as we get into the brand piece of it later. We sold that business in 2019 and became part of an Insight Venture Partners backed roll-up. Episerver, Swedish CMS, was the company we were sold into. And we were the first in of a 4 or 5 company roll-up. One of the companies we bought was Optimizely. We rebranded the whole group Optimizely. So I was running brand, demand, and digital for Optimizely, the group. So we went from about 400 staff to 12 or 1,300 people over 2 years. Wow. And then end of last year, I left Optimizely to join Paddle as CMO. And then kind of along the way have learned a huge amount from various people in different communities, marketing-wise, and also try to give back as a coach and a trainer in a few different marketing communities as well.
Very impressive, Andrew, and lots of success in there. So I'm hoping we can get some secret sauce out of you of what's working, what's not working, etc. I guess it has changed a lot for you then, with imagining Paddle is relatively smaller accounts to where you started your career out trying to hunt for these really big whales.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Paddle, we serve software companies, SaaS businesses that are selling globally. So they're mostly product-led businesses. So they've got a checkout on their site and they're needing to serve these, hundreds of territories or tens of territories globally in order to get the customer base, normally at a lower price point. And yes, they're normally smaller businesses, although we serve anyone from that first dollar revenue up to some pretty substantial businesses doing, hundreds of millions of ARR. But yeah, the average deal size, the average customer we're serving, the size of the average customer is certainly a lot smaller than it was at IDEO, where it was these absolute monstrous, Fortune 100 businesses.
Imagine you must also be doing several different marketing tactics at the same time, trying to both address the long tail of the very small businesses to the very chunky big ones as well.
Absolutely. And so we've got the whole range. We've got our own kind of product-led motion where people can self-serve and sign up for Paddle and start using it after going through our risk processes. And then, yes, we've got a more outbound target account type process to go after what we call strategic accounts. Although in most people's nomenclature, they're certainly still probably more mid-market sized, but they're big for us. And we play a really fundamental role in those businesses because we're their entire payments infrastructure. And so it's a really big purchase decision. So, even if it's a 50 million revenue business or 20 million revenue business, putting Paddle in place at that stage is certainly something that is a high consideration purchase, and they need to believe in us and our company and our brand just as much as they need to understand what the sales rep is telling them.
Yeah, 100%. And for you guys who are listening in on this talk, just treat it as you are part of the conversation. So if Andrew says something, if I say something, just ask questions. If you're interested, dig deeper. Feel free to interrupt us, and we'll pull up the questions as they come along. But to today's topic, Andrew, I think brand and demand is kind of it means a lot of different things to different people. So when you wrote to me brand versus demand, what kind of specific like terminology did you have in mind, or what does it mean for you, this split?
So I think of this split more in the time frame to show results rather than anything else. So demand, what we're meaning there is revenue marketing, identifying an ideal customer profile, a serviceable market, influencing them to sign up for your service or product, or to raise a hand to speak with a sales rep, and then making sure you can, at scale, move prospect accounts towards that process of decision. And that process is normally reasonably short term. You've got to produce results in a quarter or a couple of quarters. And then when we think about brand, really it's positioning yourself in an ideal in front of a wider ideal market for a year or two's time. And it's about how you're perceived, and it's how you're valued by the wider market, including your target market, but not necessarily just them. It's what people think you represent, both kind of emotional and rational. And it normally has a longer term payoff on the investment, although it certainly helps with demand. And we'll get back to that in a minute.
Super. I think that's a good definition. And I think for me, at least, I tend to struggle to kind of really push hardcore for brand kind of projects when you're looking at budgets, because I can't come back to the salespeople and say, here's a new account that you can sell to right now. So like, to your experience, how are you dealing with this, to the CEO, to the CFO? How do you get that kind of budget split up so they agree some of it needs to go into brand and then some needs to go into present demand?
So firstly, I think that's the assumption that many of us in marketing have. And I would challenge that assumption in terms of how sales and even the CEO and the CFO sometimes look at this. So if we just think about that, I know that my sales team would be utterly delighted if every prospect they call, pick up the phone or get on that meeting saying, hey, I love your paddle content. I've heard about you here and here. I've heard, you do this work and that work. Let's talk. If that was the reaction in that first meeting, my sales team would have it easy. Now we're getting there, and we've certainly increased awareness and the reputation of paddle and the Profit World brand over the last year. But that would massively move the needle for our sales teams. And certainly the CFOs I've worked with in this role and prior as well understand that, because I think one thing to think about from a CEO or CFO perspective is that most of the things you spend money on when it comes to your demand infrastructure and your target account go-to-market, it scales reasonably linearly with your growth. There's some economies of scale, whereas your brand investments, they tend to be a slow burn, more of an exponential curve. You plant some seeds now and they pay off big later. And so it's those outsized results. And fundamentally, the way I think about it is that if you don't invest in your brand, you're always going to be paying the price in your CAC. So if you invest in your brand and that pays off, it'll lower your customer acquisition cost for eternity. And if you don't, you'll always be struggling with that CAC payback period because you haven't made those investments up front.
It's such an interesting discussion. My team sometimes laughs at me when I replied like a cold call, because I really don't like to be at the receiver of a cold call. But if it were a brand that I really admired, I would give that BDR 10, 20 seconds to warm up, because I hear, okay, this is actually the brand I like that is calling me. And as you say, that scales eternally, that you can keep having BDRs that calls people that actually have some affection for the brand that they represent.
And if we think about that, and go another click deeper into that, at the early stage, yes, you're spending almost all of your budget on demand, because that's how you're proving, the validity of the entire business, the value proposition, your product market fit is by getting that instant response, right? It's no good at the early stage unless you're extremely well capitalized and can take a long-term view. It's no good saying I'm building an audience or, people like me. You need to be getting those deals in. So in the early days, often, if you're in a target account type motion, an outbound ABM type motion, well, probably your sales team are your brand, right? That's the brand experience.
That's true.
What that BDR says, what that salesperson says, is constructing a lot of the perspective of what you as a CEO, think about that company.
Yeah, totally. And then the budget component, when you sit and now you've probably been looking at 2023, how much you're asking for, why are you setting it up this way? And now you've actually gone through starting from scratch to now, for example, Paddle with 300, 400, 500 people. Does the kind of percentage switch over time from one to the other?
Yes. So I think it depends on a few things, not just on stage, but stage and size of business is part of it. I think if you are a business where you serve a large audience rather than a small subset of that audience, that's where a brand play, you probably are making those larger investments earlier. And, product-led growth, for as an example, would usually be, aligned with that type of overinvestment in brand, whether that's content or media or trying to be helpful through your data provisioning or free tools, freemium products, etc. I think also it does depend on company stage, because we talked about that kind of linear versus exponential curve. As you get later stage as a business, you are able to drive demand through the awareness. There's that brand to demand engine. People hear about
Yeah.
you, then you suddenly find yourself on shortlists, or they get referred, or people move jobs and take you with them.
Yeah.
And then that drag into a whole bunch of deals, which the businesses that if you think of ServiceNow and SAP and these very scaled software enterprises, Salesforce, they've built such strong brands that actually the demand engine is only doing a piece of the work because they're being carried into many, many boardrooms off the strength of that. So yeah, I think stage of business does make a difference. And certainly now at Paddle, I can spend more on brand than I did at IDEO, where we were, going from 0 employees up to probably about 60 when we sold. And so I do think stage makes a difference, but it's not the only thing.
One of the questions I always ask myself is then, how do I then build the narrative kind of how does this connect to revenue? How do I connect this to the pipeline that we're going to produce at some point? So is there any kind of, maybe what are some of the brand, say, projects that you guys have been running either this year or are going to run next year? And kind of what is the narrative of why are you guys doing these things?
So, and I realized I didn't even answer your prior question on the kind of the rough split. So let me do that as part of this.
Oh, okay,
So, at our stage, when I'm thinking about rough splits, we're probably thinking about 60% sitting in the demand function. Those more, demand generation, feeding our BDR team, feeding our sales team, probably about 30% sitting in the brand teams, and then probably 10% or so for tooling. And certainly at an earlier stage, when I was at IDEO, it was probably more kind of 80-20 or 80-10-10. And we can talk about kind of what were those shifts and in the early days at IDEO, what we invested in that I would class as brand. Where we are at Paddle, I think about a few things. Let's talk about the justification as well as some of those actual tactics. Let's just go back to what we're trying to do as marketers. We've identified a target market. Now, we want that target market to go through whatever funnel or waterfall or cycle you've defined in your business, whether it's complete BS or not, there's some process we're trying to walk people through and measure them against, right? So whether you're saying it's interest and then, awareness, then interest, then there's some decision and some action, whether it's top of funnel, middle funnel, bottom funnel. You're trying to move people from not knowing anything about your business to knowing you, to being somewhat positive towards you and understanding your proposition, to actually being actively engaged in some kind of buying cycle, to then purchasing you and then hopefully referring you and actually buying more of your product over time. If we think about that marketing process, we understand there's a target market. We've got to define a message that matters. And then we've got to use a range of tactics and channels to reach that target market with that message, and then have some measurement framework for how we're moving them towards that commercial end goal. In that framework, I think brand's got a lot to play here. And there's kind of a couple of things that I think are really important. The first one is that a lot of that top of funnel, the activity that isn't related to your brand, your product, isn't related to kind of features and functions. That often sits within
awareness that this brand exists.
Awareness that this brand exists. How are we being helpful? How are we solving the problems of that end user before they ever see who we are and what we do as a company? And so I think that's one way to think about it. And then secondly, it's making sure that every experience is a quality experience. Because if it is, then that's how you build trust. That's how you build reputation. And those conversion rates through that funnel start to increase. And so I think about brand really is the same way as I think about trust. It's having a positive experience consistently. And if you consistently have a positive experience with Paddle, then you are much more likely to firstly get into the consideration phase with Paddle, and also you're likely to move faster through those steps. And so I think those are the two main justifications are, how can we increase the pool of our target accounts that are engaging with us as a business, not our product proposition, not our pricing page, but they're engaging with our podcast. They're listening to this LinkedIn Live with yourself from Dreamdata. And then how is that kind of the quality of that brand experience, the way we are being helpful and therefore demanding reciprocation over time in that normal human exchange, how are we increasing those conversion rates through the funnel?
That's some really, really, really solid advice for maybe just running a business. I really think deeply about that. Nobody should have a bad interaction with us at any given point, and we need to help anybody that we can help in any way, because like any interaction is an opportunity to make a new friend. Like, how do we get one more person to say something positive about us?
Totally. And often I think it's really important to not see brand as some faraway thing you can do once you've, raised hundreds of millions of dollars, or
Yeah,
once you,
and the
have
Super
an
Bowl
IPO.
campaign.
Yeah, because actually it is about just improving the quality of that experience. And so
Yeah.
I think about, brand in the early days is often about thoughtfulness and insight than it is about budget. So with everything you're doing right now, do you have some insight on why it matters to that target customer? And are you being thoughtful about how you're designing that experience? So, you might have a swag budget and you're making t-shirts. Great. So are those t-shirts just, a boring white shirt with your logo on them? Or are
Yeah.
they something that's a little bit more interesting that someone would actually want to wear, right? Super simple example. But, it's something that adds a bit, add some thoughtfulness and some time, and then you can improve that experience. When we think about this from Paddle's perspective, that kind of 30% of the spend, some examples from this year would be, when we acquired Profitwell, we filmed a documentary, 18-minute documentary behind the scenes, in the deal room, in the due diligence, with the lawyers, talking about price, talking about the negotiation, the human story, because our target customer is the CEO or executive of a software business that probably either have been through acquisition or want to go through acquisition. And so by revealing behind the scenes what's going on there, it's helpful, it's inspirational, it's useful. Does it tell them anything about Paddle? No, not at all. But it starts their journey with our business, and it's being thoughtful. It didn't cost that much, but it's being thoughtful based on a fundamental insight. If we go to maybe our event executions, if you came to SaaStr or SaaStr.
Yeah, I watched the premiere at SaaStr in Barcelona. Or I watched half of it at least, and then I think later the same day I was on a boat that the Paddle had rented and had some beers together with my colleague, and that these are kind of okay. If they take me on a boat and they serve me a beer, I at least owe them like a like and a thumbs up here and there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's being a bit more thoughtful than just giving away coffee vouchers at the booth. And then what you'll have seen at those booths, what we're trying to do there when we show up to an event is not just have a booth and have a bunch of salespeople pitching, but we're going to try and make it useful. And so, at SaaStr over in Dublin, we did something that the Profitwell team have been doing for a few years. We had a podcast booth, a stage at our booth. And so instead of us hard pitching a bunch of people, we had the top keynote speakers from the event come and sit down and have a one-to-one conversation with Patrick or Neil, our product manager, or myself about a topic that was interesting, and gathered people who were wandering around looking for coffee to go and deep dive into a specific subject and ask questions. So again, adding a little bit more insight and a little bit more thoughtfulness, and not really much more budget.
I think it's really inspirational, Andrew, to hear this kind of, like, you actually care so much about every single execution of marketing activity. If we return to this kind of, or you can, if there's any comments to that, just go ahead first.
So I think as a business, there's a few things that we're trying to do. We have a few fundamental principles. As a product principle, we're trying to make software that just does things for you. Rather than help you do things better, we want to take away the load and do it for you. As a brand, we want to be the most helpful brand in SaaS. And when we think about that, it's about making sure we are a source of inspiration, education, a source of measurement and data and benchmarking. There's lots of things we can do there. But one of the things that certainly myself and Patrick have talked about a bunch of times is that we want to constantly be doing things that our market, the reaction is kind of a WTF type of reaction. It's how have they got the time and how have they got the thoughtfulness to go and do this for such a niche audience? So another silly example, I did a webinar a while back with Adam Schonfeld, who's a researcher, 3-time SaaS founder, researches PLG. And so in order to make that webinar a bit different and special, we custom created an audio intro, like a rap about PLG that was funny. It was a bit tongue-in-cheek. It was done by a music producer I knew, and we played it before the webinar. Didn't tell him about it, and played it before the webinar started, just as a way of livening up the audience. Right? Again, didn't cost that much money. It just needed a bit of insight on what we were talking about and a bit of creativity and thoughtfulness. But again, those little moments spark a bit of a WTF reaction, because there's very few B2B marketers have that kind of custom thought go into the experience that's being designed for them.
It's good lessons. If we go into the kind of the versus then, and you said like maybe your budget is going to be like 60% on the demand side for next year. So what is the kind of if we've already talked a little bit about it, but what is kind of the counter argument for us marketers having to spend like 60% of the budget driving new demand for our sales teams?
So sorry, what's the argument for the 60% or
I don't know. I guess we have to sell something with the time and money we spend as well.
Wholeheartedly. And I see the short-term impact and the impact of that demand spend in terms of pipeline really being earning the right to do some of these other things. So, in the early days, often you're, adding time, as I said, and insight and thoughtfulness into those experiences to try and punch harder, but you can't add much budget, and you earn the right to add a bit of budget, a few dollars to those exercises by hitting those short-term goals. I don't think there's a marketer on the planet who's going to be around for 3 or 4 quarters spending lots on brand if they're not hitting those next quarter targets and making sure the sales team are happy.
So I think that's really well put, that we can do the fun stuff if we hit our targets. We cannot do the fun stuff if we don't hit our targets, because then your budgets are going down because we need to save money as a company. It's just kind of the balance of how it is to like run a commercial operation.
Yeah, totally. But let's also reclassify or redefine that idea of fun, because I think both elements can be fun. What I do really believe is that sometimes this is actually about boldness. It's about kind of overcoming the fear of what will happen if that fails. Think things like that documentary, things like that little custom audio wrap, things like a podcast booth at an event, things like putting a bit extra time into swag design. All of those things they take a bit of boldness, because they could come across and not work. They could fall flat on their face. And really, in both your demand team and in your brand team, you've got to be building this constant willingness to experiment. But often in the brand side of things,
I saw Patrick saying churn on stage at, was it Zastock, where that was the only word he used. And I took that Twitter thread and shared to all my colleagues and my marketing friends and see, like, look at the boldness of this guy.
Yeah. And one of the things
that WTF moment.
And if we, again, let's just stop and think about that. So he thought really carefully about whether to do that or not, because that could have fallen flat on its face, right? And there were some people who walked out in the first few minutes of that talk. But what's really interesting is it was the most talked about, session, and it really delivered value, because there was a huge amount of benchmarking data on those slides. And what was really interesting is, because often if we're in a keynote, we're sitting there probably doing email or Slack and listening to a little bit what's coming in our ears from the keynote speaker. When the person on stage is not giving any value at all from their mouth, suddenly everybody in the entire room has to be looking at the slides, and there's a single track of devoted attention to what's coming up on every single slide. And we saw that through the entire session.
That's super interesting. If we open kind of the demand bucket at Paddle for kind of the next year, then kind of what are the kind of the pillars there that is going to keep your sales team busy?
So within our demand function, we have the BDRs within our demand function, and then we have.
Do they just like organizational? Do they report into you then the BDRs? Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there's lots of good reasons why they can report somewhere else, or they can report into marketing. I think a couple of things are really important for me in that decision. Number one, that their primary promotion path is into sales, regardless. I've got fantastic BDRs who have ended up in field marketing or go-to-market strategy or other areas, but predominantly most of them are looking for an account exec role. And so it's making sure that they know that that's always the obvious promotion path if they do well. The second thing is that I love having BDRs in marketing, because it means that everybody in the whole marketing function understands that the output of their work in the quarter is producing a number of opportunities with a pipeline dollar value. And if that sits across there in sales, it's too easy for marketing to focus on much softer metrics. And so I really like having that revenue component within marketing. So we think about demand in terms of our BDR team, and then our demand team, which is really running email and paid, so campaigns that are primarily distributed via those two channels. And then thirdly, our field marketing. So pop-up events, dinners, drinks, whether virtual or physical around the world. So those are really the three components of our demand team.
And then what does that summarize to of the total demand, or like the total opportunities that Paddle need? Does that come from your unit then, or is there like a separate, I don't know, sales unit or something like that will create some of the other opportunities?
Absolutely. So our sales team are sourcing some of those opportunities themselves. And so they're doing their own prospecting. They're working hand in hand, in a very normal fashion with their BDRs in pairs. But they're also sourcing their own opportunities. But yes, I want marketing, really. That DG function is taking the burden of opening up a bunch of opportunities for sales reps and with sales reps, and then is also running these kind of one to few or one to many events. So whether that's a physical event, a virtual event, using our newsletter, paid social, and search in order to get people raising their hands to say they want to talk to a rep. That's going to be the focus of that DG team.
Nice. And then for you guys listening, like we've promised Andrew, he can go pick up his kids within time scope. So like if you do have questions for Andrew, now is the time to type them in.
We've got a question here from Sander saying, would the brand impact on CAC be a leap of faith argument towards the C-suite? So
would the brand impact on CAC be a leap of faith argument towards the C-suite, or could it be backed up by data?
So I think there's there's one bit of intuition and two bits of data I'd think about here. So the intuitive piece of this is, is this going to improve the experience, either the number of experiences top of funnel or the experience that drives conversion? So that's an intuitive piece. And then there's two bits of data you can actually measure there. Number one, it's benchmarking against other companies. What are other companies spending on these type of campaigns, programs, exercises? And then secondly, it's do we think that has some likelihood of actually improving any one of those conversion points by a certain number of percentage points? So those would be the three things I think about. Like intuitively, is this the right thing to do because it's going to give a better experience? And then what do we estimate that experience means for our either top of funnel conversion rates? And thirdly, benchmarking data that we can measure against.
Cool. I guess it also comes down to what is the history of this company? Do we believe in marketing? Does the CEO, CFO believe in these things working? I've definitely known some people in my network where I know they're great marketers, but it just doesn't work out because they've been like historically they've been sales driven, and then marketing is not like a driver of pipeline or revenue and of that sort.
Yep. And when we're thinking about that marketing and sales kind of partnership, it's also just really important to understand where your CEO sits on that partnership too. And many great product focused CEOs really do have a strong affinity for marketing because they can understand, particularly perhaps in a more product-led world, how interlinked quality marketing, brand building is with the success of the product.
I consistently say that like the quickest way to improve the marketing ROI is to become best friends with the salespeople. But because at the end of the day, as you say, what we are to do is produce opportunities, and then it's the salespeople who gets the contract signed. So if they don't like the demand that you produce, then all the money you spend, if they don't pick up the phone, send emails, etc., are, if not wasted, then at least not utilized to what it could be.
Yeah, completely. And if we think about where we sit in the evolution of SaaS, there is, companies every day launching into every one of our spaces, right? Competition is increasing, whether it is AI or no code or any of the other kind of platforms, the shoulders of giants that people can build upon. Launching a product is becoming easier and easier. And therefore, the pressure is on distribution. The pressure is on marketing. And so that's one way that I think we are starting to see a shift towards a stronger brand muscle in many businesses, even earlier stage businesses, because they simply can't cut through by running the same outbound SDR cadence playbook alongside another 200 SDRs that are doing the same thing. And therefore, it needs that being helpful, producing a quality experience, providing insight for the customer, whatever you want to frame your brand experience as, it needs that at an earlier stage to even cut through and get that distribution.
I really agree. And also like the same with the ad platforms, the auctions keeps going up because more and more people are buying digital ads. So it gets more and more expensive to like kind of brute force your way through. Okay, 2 questions, Andrew. Let's run through them quickly. First one, how do you avoid that a strong brand limits demand growth? comes a little bit counterintuitive that it would limit it, but I don't know how you interpret it.
Yeah, so maybe Michael can clarify in a follow-up comment. The one case I've seen where it can limit demand growth is where the brand is not focused on the target customer, where there is someone who is looking to do widespread PR and spending lots of budget on comms that are so universal that they're not actually serving that target market. And then there's a couple of things that happen. Your demand teams, your BDR teams, your sales teams end up in constant disqualification mode because you're not actually attracting the right type of customer. And that actually can limit demand because it means that they're spending time on the wrong type of customer. And secondly, it's about budget cannibalization. You're spending budget on things that are serving a wider market, and therefore you can't spend the right money on the actual market you can serve.
Super nicely spotted there. Okay, last one. Any thoughts on share of search being a leading indicator for share of market, as brand campaigns can impact this considerably?
Yeah, I think share of search is a great one to track. Sometimes in the early days, it's just such low numbers, both in terms of perhaps the terms you're tracking and also your share of them, that it can be really demoralizing, or it just doesn't have the significance. But I do think it's something absolutely to track. Another thing that, and we've talked a bit about this, Stefan, before we jumped on this LinkedIn Live, is to think about self-reported attribution. So how can you allow your prospects to tell you where they heard about you? And that's something that we use regularly. We have a self-reported attribution field. How did you hear about Paddle? And it'll often be, actually another paddle seller told me about you, or I saw your checkout on XYZ product that I loved, or I listened to Patrick Campbell's podcast, or I saw you at Sasquatch.
A boat in Barcelona.
Yeah, a boat in Barcelona, exactly. And so that's a really good way of measuring some of those brand investments as well.
Yeah, that's very reasonable. Okay, Andrew, where do we end up in this brand versus demand discussion then?
Well, I mean, for me, I think it's absolutely vital that we see these as two sides of the same coin, and we see brand as something that you can invest in super early stage, as long as you're thinking about it from a how do I build insights and how am I being thoughtful about those experiences. So any early stage marketers, focus your time and energy on brand, on making sure those outbound SDR experiences, the first salesperson experience, the ads you're running, the events you're going to, all of those things have a quality experience. And, if I go back to the early days at IDEO, brand for us was, steak dinners in New York with our top prospects, and then walking away from that and genuinely loving it and emailing us to say, next time you're in town, make sure I'm at that table with you. I loved the conversation. Or it was early work with Forrester Research, doing webinars with an analyst where we were putting money into something that was serving a wider market, not just our target accounts, but significantly increasing our reputation. Or it was very creative swag that we were sending as direct mail to certain people. We had a content personalization proposition. And so we would talk about being the Netflix of financial services content or enterprise tech content, and send people popcorn and Netflix vouchers. And that's a bit passé now, but 5-6 years ago, it really cut through. And it was memorable, and it had a positive reaction. So I think in the early days, it's making sure you don't push demand off of something you can't afford or be in the future. And it's coming back to that first point, which is if you're not investing in brand from the beginning, then you're always going to be paying the price in your customer acquisition costs and your conversion rates for the rest of your life.
I think that's a perfect summary, Andrew. That kind of it's not versus. We just need to have a plus there instead. So all demand activities are actually like contributing to that one more person giving you a like, thumbs up, positive tone of voice when they speak about your brand at some point. Brilliant. On to the kids, Andrew, and thank you so much for taking the time. It was super inspirational for me, and I hope for some of you guys who were listening as well.
Really appreciate the time and love what you're doing at Dreamdata.
We hope you like listening to us. Subscribe to our podcast and the ones that we have been guests on.
And if you have any feedback for us, just do let us know. And should there be a guest that you think we should be talking to, then pitch us.
We're looking forward to seeing you.